Today we're going to be stiffening up and also reinforcing our E36 M3. We've got some goodies from ECS Tuning and Turner Motorsport. We've got a chassis brace, we've got a strut bar, we even got some carbon fiber, and even some shields to protect our engine. Even though it's the S50 and it's the US version of the S50, so that's pretty much an M50, pretty slow. But we're still going to make the best of the E36 M3 in most of its stock form. Our M3 is on coilovers, but they're a little bit past their lifespan as well. So it's a little bit loosey-goosey, and we're going to be hopefully stiffening it up just a bit with all of these aftermarket upgrades. While I'm installing these parts, I'll give you guys any tips and pointers. I'll also let you guys know if there are any fitment issues and what exactly is the benefit of doing it. So let's just get right to it. Let's get this E36 M3 a little bit stiffer. So we're going to start out right here in the front in the engine bay with the ECS Tuning strut bar. I wanted to go with this wrinkle black because a little bit more stealth. I mean, obviously the car is green, we wrapped it green, but at least in here it's going to be a little bit stealthy. And most of the color scheme, we don't really have any chrome or anything shiny on here, so this is going to be perfect. It's got the ECS Tuning logo on it, but I believe it's vinyl, so if you really wanted to take it off, you could. This is detachable, so if you need to work on the engine, it should be easy to just remove the center section, you can get right to it. But I do already see one problem right off the bat. This hole in the center is very small. But in this case, if you have some kind of camber adjustment, if you have aftermarket coilovers, camber plates, anything like that, you're not going to be able to get to it. Now, I feel like this is a pretty easy fix. You can just cut around this hole, make it a little bit bigger, and then that should give you that adjustability that you need. Or if you do need to adjust it, you just take the whole thing off. It's only 3 nuts that hold it in place on both towers, so it's pretty straightforward to install and remove if you need to. We've got the Eibach coilovers on here, which utilize this factory strut mounts. So we don't really have any camber adjustability, and I am eventually going to change those out. As you'll see, the top hat's pretty rusty. Those bearings are likely shot as well. But right now, I'm not too worried about that. I want to get all this stuff installed and get back to driving it. Now, one thing I am a little worried about is if these studs are going to be long enough, because there is a reinforcement plate on top of the actual top hat. Now, all of the BMWs of this era, E36, even the E46 era, these strut towers do tend to mushroom. And by that, they get deformed from all of the wear and tear over the years. So the reinforcement plate that's on here is a great option to prevent that from happening. And then the strut bar is going to be another option as well, because it's going to sandwich this whole strut tower together and prevent it from deforming. So the reinforcement plate, I'll have that linked down below as well. It's just the same outline of the actual holes, and it just bolts right in. No! Come on. Now this is what we call a 10-minute job, not even a 10-minute, a 5-minute job that's probably going to turn into an hour. So this whole stud is pressed into the top hat, and the stud either it sheared all of the splines or it just fell down somehow. I'm not sure how. Maybe when they were installing it, they really had to push it up, so it was already a little bit loose, but it was tightened down, so I'm not sure why. Damn. Let me try the other one. I'm going to have to push it up from underneath somehow. So what I did was I actually spaced it out from underneath. I lifted up the whole stud and then tightened it back down. That way it pulls the stud back into the top hat. Hopefully that does the trick. What I'm going to do, I'm going to wire wheel off some of this rust, and that should prevent the nut from getting caught up on these threads. Well, this wire brush has definitely seen better days. I don't want to scratch up the paint. I guess you could say we got a little lucky. All of this stud is a little bit crooked now, but whenever we replace the coilovers, we're gonna replace all that anyways. So technically this top hat is actually mushrooming a little bit because each stud is pointing a different way. Even these two, they're not fully straight and parallel to each other. You know how I said at the beginning of the video, we are gonna find other stuff that we need to replace, other maintenance items. I'm just waiting until we lift it up and we see the oily mess that's gonna be underneath. This time I'm gonna do this before we try to take off the nuts. The nuts. Shiny, 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 yeah. So that's funny. Only one stud on each side was super, super rusty. Not really funny, but. So I had originally thought this whole process was gonna be about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes tops. This whole thing ended up being an hour. So we first had the issue with the stud on the top hat on the passenger side. And then once we got both of the sections of the strut bar installed, when we went to put in the center bar, the actual bar that goes across, it just would not fit. Now chances are, this is a 1995 M3. It's almost as old as me, and actually a little bit older than me. And what probably happened is these strut towers are a little bit deformed, they've bent over time, and that's most likely what was the issue. So what I ended up having to do, I tried prying on it, I did everything I could, try to line up the holes, but in the end I did have to elongate one of the holes. We got that elongated, barely, I mean I probably took off less than 1 millimeter of material, maybe a little bit more actually, but we got it in there. We just need to tighten everything down, and since the car is already on its own weight, we didn't lift it up or anything, so the preload and all of that should be fine just right here. I think it's gonna be extra preloaded with how difficult it was for us to get it in. But now I'm just gonna tighten all the bolts down. All of the nuts for the top hats are 13 millimeters, and you just want to torque those to factory specs. Now for us, since we have the reinforcement plate on top of the top hat, and then comes the strut tower, and then comes the actual strut bar itself, our nut is engaging fully on all the threads of the studs. But if it didn't, that would be something that you wouldn't really want to run it like that. You would want to get extended studs or just replace the studs with a nut and bolt. For us, everything is going to be fine. Just going to torque everything down and we should be good to go. Now another thing, like I said before, if you have aftermarket suspension, if you have camber adjustability or even damper adjustability like the Coney struts, you're not going to be able to adjust them. You might even have to remove the top section of the adjuster in order for it to fit. Just a word of caution for you guys. Let me get this signed up. Let's move on to the back. Next up, we have the rear strut bar. The rear strut bar is super simple. You just need to remove the trunk carpeting and you should have access to the shock mounts. But in our E36, we have aftermarket shock mounts, which puts the nuts into the wheel well under the car. So I actually had to unbolt the rear shocks in order to remove the shock mounts and then install the strut bar. Now the strut bar is 3 pieces, just like the front, but this one is made from carbon fiber. It's a shame that it's going to be hidden in the trunk. Now once I got the shocks removed, I put the strut bar ends directly to the shock tower and then reinstall the shock mounts and shocks. Once I had both sides installed, it was just time for me to bolt in the carbon fiber middle section. Now you do want to make sure that the jam nuts are loose on the middle section so you can install the bolts from each end piece into the middle piece. Now once you have everything bolted in, you can tighten everything down, but you do still need to preload the bar. To preload the bar, you want to keep turning the middle section until you have very slight resistance. Then you should just turn it 1 full revolution and tighten the jam nuts. And you want to make sure you're doing all of this when the car is on its own weight. Alright, so we're getting ready to install the Turner Motorsport X brace, which is just going to stiffen up the whole section from the steering rack, the subframe, to where the actual factory, they have a bar that goes for stiffening from factory. So it's going to tie into all of that, and it's pretty much bolt-on. Only thing is, on some E36s, on your subframe, these 2 holes will not be threaded on both sides. And we need to have those threaded. If yours aren't threaded, the Turner Motorsport kit does come with these Rivnuts. So what you would need is you would need a Rivnut tool, and you would put that in there, and that will make that hole threaded. So for us, we're lucky. They are completely threaded. We're just going to clean the threads up, and once those are cleaned up, we'll remove this bar, and then we're ready to go ahead and put it on. We do have an oily mess, and that's partly because the oil pan is cracked, and then obviously it's a BMW, so it's going to leak some oil. I mean, otherwise, how would you know there's even any oil in it? So that blue, luckily it's an anodized blue, so it should be able to get cleaned up pretty quickly whenever we do decide to fix all of these leaks. The Turner Motorsport X brace does come fully disassembled. So you're going to have 4, I would say, ears, 1 for each corner of this X brace. Now for the top 2, you're only going to put 1 bolt in on each side, and you're going to put all the bolts in loosely at this point. The bottom ones, you are going to put all 4 of them in, 2 on each side, and once again, you're going to leave everything loose, that way you can get it installed on the car, and then we're going to tighten everything down there. One thing that I would recommend is to have the Turner Motorsport guide, which will be linked down below in the description. The guide is going to come very handy because it tells you exactly how to assemble in what order. For example, the top 2 ears, you're only going to be installing 1 bolt, and the bolts that are going in the top 2 ears are a little bit smaller than the rest of the ear bolts. These threaded holes have been exposed to the elements the whole time. There's a lot of gunk and grime built up in there, so I ran a thread chaser right through there, that way just to make sure none of the threads were damaged and get all that dirt out of there. So part of the issue here is our front subframe, some of the mounting holes are just a little bit bent. So this bolt didn't go in completely straight, kind of scratched up the anodizing. I mean, not horribly, but it is a little bit scratched up. And it feels like the oil pan is actually touching this X brace. Now the engine mounts on here are about, I'll say about 10,000 miles, maybe at most about 2 years old. So the engine mounts are good, they're still practically new, but I feel like the subframe is a little tweaked, and that's probably the reason why it's touching the oil pan. I don't think it's gonna be that big of a deal. It might have just like a hair clearance, maybe like a sheet of paper could slide through. I'm about to check it out. But besides that, I got everything else tightened up. Okay, we got clearance. Yes, sir. We got the chassis brace installed. The last thing that we have is this Turner Motorsport skid plate. So this is going to attach in the front. It attaches to the front bumper and then to the chassis legs using these brackets. So we're going to have to use some Rivnuts. We're going to have to install those into the chassis legs. That way we can attach these brackets. And then also we're going to have to drill some holes into the front bumper so we can attach this to the bumper. Now this is just going to tie everything together. It's going to tie in the fender liners and also the front bumper. All that stuff is going to be nice and secure. We don't have to worry about it flapping around, and it'll prevent any rocks and stuff getting up into the belt area of the engine. So the brackets actually need to be installed to the chassis legs on both sides. Now you can see there's just a square hole right here, which we're going to have to drill out a little bit bigger. Then we have this plastic fastener, which we're going to pry out, and we're going to drill that hole out a little bit bigger as well. Once the holes are drilled out, then we can install the Rivnut that's included with the kit, but you are going to need a Rivnut tool. You can buy that off of Amazon. I'll have that link down below as well. So we're just going to put those 2 Rivnuts in on both sides, and then we can attach the brackets there with screws. I had a hard time drilling out these holes for the bracket to go into, mainly because they're square holes and they're almost already the right size, so the drill bit just kept threading itself into the hole. The way I was able to do it, I used a 3/8 drill bit first, and I barely put any pressure on there, just did it very loosely and got that whole square hole chewed up a little bit to make it circular. I even tried to go with a step bit, that did help a little bit as well, but eventually I worked my way up to a 25/64 bit. Now it doesn't look the prettiest, and I did scratch up a couple of spots on the frame rail, and before we install those Rivnuts, we are going to throw some paint on all of the exposed metal surfaces to prevent any rust in the future. Now we're going to be installing the Rivnuts into these chassis legs. So I have a Rivnut tool, which I got off of Amazon, which I'll link down below as well. Another option you have is ECS Tuning does have a Rivnut tool, like a manual one that you can get, or if you wait until the end of this video, when we're installing the shield, I talk about another type of tool that you can also use. Whenever you're installing a Rivnut and using a tool like the one that I'm using, you want to make sure you're putting even pressure and pushing the Rivnut against the surface that you're trying to install it into. Because if it does come out a little bit, it's going to be crooked or it's going to wobble around a little bit. And you also want to make sure you're tightening in the holder into the Rivnut every time you let go of the handles. So every time you release it a little bit, it crunches up a little bit, you're gonna have a little bit more space where you can tighten that threaded portion back into the Rivnut, and that's just gonna get you a square and straight clamping force. So I've got the Rivnuts installed for both sides, and I've got the brackets just loosely installed with the bolts that were provided. Now, as you can see, I've got both of the brackets pointing towards each other, and the brackets are completely parallel with the frame rail of the car. So they're not really labeled, they're not labeled left and right. So the way you have to look at it is they have to be pointing towards each other, like this curve. They need to be pointing towards each other, and they need to be parallel to the frame rails. So they gotta be completely flat. Now that we've got both of these in there, all of the screws that are provided are the same size, so you don't have to worry about that. What we really need to do now is we need to put that whole splash shield, the tray, put it up against this, loosely install it to these brackets. That way we can map out where we need to drill holes on the bumper itself. So now you can see we've just got it loosely attached to the brackets, but the back of this is hitting the sway bar. So what we need to do is we need to adjust this, and then once we have it adjusted, we can figure out where we want to drill all the holes on the front bumper. And that's why you want all of the brackets on there loosely, so you can move everything around to position it. So now I've got the shield exactly where I want it. It's still loose, but I'm using this jack to just hold it up against the bumper. Now you kind of want to make sure it's symmetrical on both sides of the bumper. The fender liners, everything is going to attach to this shield. And I really like this design because it's just going to secure everything. I hate when the fender liners start flapping around. Part of the reason why I haven't put the new ones on yet is because I want to make sure everything is secure. We don't want to ruin the new ones. So what I'm going to do now is, now that all of this is clearanced out enough where I want it, is symmetrical on both sides of the bumper, I'm just going to use this little pick and put marks on where all of the holes I need to drill into the bumper. So the pick is not going to work. We have an aftermarket bumper on here, and the bumper curves up a little bit, so I'm just going to use the drill. So I've got all of the holes marked that I need to drill. Now I'm just going to take off the shield. We need to drill out those holes a little bit bigger and then use the provided rib nuts and put those on the bumper itself so we can secure this to the bumper. Now the fender liner section we don't really need to worry about right now. That's going to just go in through here, and you're going to use just the factory mounting brackets that come with the fender liners. Now if you don't have any fender liners, you don't really need to worry about it at all. So the rib nuts that we're going to be using for the bumper are bigger than the ones that we use for these brackets. Now these, you're going to need a Rivnut tool that is pretty deep to get in there. The one that I was using doesn't have an attachment that will go all the way through this, because the threaded section's all the way at the tip, and we have all of this empty space which is going to get clamped around the bumper. Now these Rivnuts are special for plastics and stuff like that. That way it doesn't just pull through like the other ones would. Now if you don't have a tool that will work, you can go get one of these. This is made by Dorman. I'll have it linked down below. The problem with this is that it comes with a bolt that's too short. So what you're going to need is a longer M6 bolt with the same thread count, and you should be able to just go in your spare bolts bin and find one of those. Now you can make one of these tools at home. All you really need is a nut that's not threaded, or just a bigger threaded nut than an M6. That way this can hold against the bumper and hold the rivet against the bumper as well while you clamp it down. So the way it works is this nut is just hollow all the way through. There's no threads. Now if you do have a threaded nut like this, you can just get one that is bigger than an M6. And then you have your M6 bolt. This is the one that comes with it, but this is the one that we're going to use. And it goes through this right here, and it threads into this. So then what's gonna happen is this is gonna go into the bumper, the hole that we're about to drill, and you're gonna push it into there. Then you're gonna hold this with a wrench, and you're gonna turn this bolt. You're gonna keep tightening the bolt. As you tighten the bolt, this whole thing is gonna crush. So all of these little fingers are gonna crush and pull out, and they're gonna go against the back side of the bumper and hold this riv nut in place. So once it's crushed, it's gonna go down to about half its size, maybe even a little bit less, but the threaded section is gonna stay intact. That way you can thread a bolt through there afterwards. But first, we need to drill out all of those holes to the 25/64 as recommended by ECS and Turner Motorsport for their riv nuts. Now we need to hold that and then tighten this. Okay, so now you can see how it looks nice and clamped and it's not going to pull out. And all of the threads are still intact. Now you do it to the rest of the holes. With all those riv nuts installed into the front bumper, it was finally time to do the final assembly. All of the bolts, like I said before, are the same size. The ones that go into the brackets, the ones that go into the chassis legs, and the ones that go into all of the riv nuts on the bumper. So to install all these, you do want to start, on one side and install everything loosely first before you tighten it down on the final tightening round. Now for me, I did have a couple of issues with some of those riv nuts not being exactly where you needed them to be. I was able to make it work, but if this happens to you, an easy option would be to just elongate the hole a little bit on the actual tray itself, because once those riv nuts are installed, you can't really play with them, you can't really move them around or anything like that. So the only options for adjustability you're going to have in terms of the hole not lining up is to drill the actual tray itself. And then once I had everything positioned, all of the bolts in, I tightened everything down. Now there's no real torque spec that's listed from Turner Motorsport, but these are some M6 bolts, so I would just snug them down as much as you can. Don't mind the inside, it's a work in progress. But let's go for a test drive. All right, so I've been driving the E36 for a little bit with all the new mods, and I'm gonna be completely honest with you guys. You're not going to feel these mods that much unless you're on the track or if you're doing a lot of canyon driving or mountain driving and back roads and stuff like that. Then you'll feel the tightness a good amount. But there's three main benefits, maybe more, but three that I can name right off the top of my head from installing these mods. The first one, with both of the strut bars, the front and rear, on most BMWs of this era, the strut towers and the shock towers end up deforming over time. And that's just because of all of the roads, all of the spirited driving that we do in these cars. It causes those strut towers and the shock towers to deform. And the strut braces are just going to provide reinforcement from not allowing that to happen as frequently. And the main reason is because you're sandwiching the strut mount and the shock mounts with the strut bars. You're sandwiching that middle section together. So it's just reinforcing all of that. Now, the second thing is that chassis X brace. It's also providing some reinforcement. It's gonna make the whole chassis a little bit tighter because it does tie that front subframe into the frame rails. Now, I know BMW did do this on the E36 LTW editions. They had a factory brace, which you can also buy, but this one just looks a lot nicer, and honestly, it's built a lot better. Now, that front shield is just going to prevent all the rocks and debris from getting thrown up into the engine bay. It's going to protect your engine, protect your belts, all of that. And it also ties that front bumper into the frame rails as well as the fender liners. And I think the other main benefit is they look good. All these mods look good. The rear, that carbon fiber looks good. The front strut bar, you can get aluminum version as well. That also looks good. And the underside, you're not really going to see all that stuff. But if you do ever look on it, if you're doing your oil change or whatever the case may be, you can still see it. So overall, like I said, you're not gonna notice a huge benefit in terms of drivability if you're just daily driving your car. But in spirited driving conditions, it will definitely have some improvement. With that being said, our AC's just stopped working on this E36 and it's getting pretty hot in here. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any questions, make sure you comment down below. If you need any diagnostic help, be sure to go to my website, shoplivetv.com, and I can help you out there. Besides that, everything that was installed in this video is going to be linked down below along with the guides provided for these parts. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys in our next video.